I'm a 25-year-old male, and this terrifying experience occurred just last year when I decided to take a solo vacation. Luckily, one of my friends owned a cabin near the area I planned to visit, which turned out to be a lifesaver in terms of saving money. The cabin was a place I'd heard my friends speak about often and had seen numerous photos of. It was described as the coziest and most relaxing place in the world, precisely what I yearned for during my vacation. However, little did I know that this getaway would turn into a nightmare. The cabin was nestled in an isolated area approximately 40 minutes away from the nearest town. The remoteness added to its charm. Though much of that time was consumed navigating a slow drive down a dirt road upon my arrival, I couldn't help but stand outside for what must have been an hour, gazing off into the distances,avoring the serene beauty of nature and the overwhelming quietness once the daylight started to fade. I decided to prepare an early dinner and indulged in some time on my phone as the evening approached. It made up my mind to make the most of the remaining daylight with a short walk. There were several small trails adjacent to the cabin which had caught my attention earlier. I texted my friend to double check if these were indeed trails and if they were safe to explore. He assured me that there was nothing to worry about and mentioned that the closest stone behind the cabin, LED straight through the woods. This sounded perfect to me, so I laced up my walking boots and embarked on the trail. It wasn't the smoothest path, but it was far from challenging, and I felt confident I couldn't get lost. My primary concern was straying off the trail, so I walked for about half an hour, immersing myself in the natural surroundings and letting my mind wander. Then something unsettling happened. I heard a noise that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the sound of a man's voice, loud and harsh, but it seemed to be coming from a distance. I scanned the woods around, measuring to pinpoint the source of the voice, but I couldn't see anyone. The voices spoke again, this time from somewhere to the right of the trail, but still concealed from my view. It's thought the man was speaking angrily, possibly shouting at someone, though I couldn't understand. And the language, a sense of unease washed over me. I didn't know if there were any other cabins or houses nearby, so I couldn't determine if it was normal for someone to be in this area. What made it strange was that they weren't on the trail. I listened for a few more minutes, hearing the man's voice repeatedly. Yet none ever responded audibly, at least not loudly enough for me to discern. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously moved closer to where the voice was coming from, trying to remain hidden. I didn't want to reveal my presence. I just wanted to ensure that nothing was seriously amiss. Carefully, I kept Taney on the trail as I ventured deeper into the woods, but as I drew closer to the source of the voice, all the talking and yelling abruptly ceased. A chilling feeling to creep over me. I sensed something was terribly wrong, and being alone in the woods was now the last place I wanted to be. The sun was gradually sinking below the horizon, casting eerie shadows through the trees, and it was my cue to abandon my quest and return to the safety of the cabin. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing through the quiet woods. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable crunch of leaves behind me. I snapped my head around, but the dancing shadows created by the fading light made it challenging to see clearly. Someone was running, and it seemed like they were closing in on me from somewhere out in the woods not too far away. Panic surged through me, and I immediately turned and sprinted the rest of the way back to the cabin on its inside. I locked all the doors and windows. I peered out of the back window, and to my horror saw a man in a thick hoodie approaching the cabin. He held something in his hand, and it was clear that his intentions were far from benign. In a desperate moment, I grabbed my keys and bolted for my car parked at the front of the cabin. I raced away without seeing anyone pursuing me. When I finally spoke with my friend about the incident, I iterated that Noon should have been in that area. The identity of the man and the reason for his presence in the woods remained a mystery. But one thing was certain: if I had stayed in that cabin, I might have never been seen again. I was out camping in a familiar forest in Colorado, a place I'd visited countless times over the years. My home was a couple of hours away, but I always found solace in this wilderness, coming out every couple when the weather was nice. This particular trip started like any other. I had my camp set up and had already spent 2 full days here, focusing on mundane tasks like getting my tent situated and going fishing in the nearby river. On the 3rd day, I decided to embark on a hike just north of my campsite. There were no designated trails in this area, but I was confident in my knowledge of the landmarks nearby and had all the necessary equipment to ensure I didn't get lost. So I began my hike simply enjoying the serenity of the forest, the sun-washed eye in the sky casting dappled shadows through the trees. And the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves underfoot as I walked further up the mountain. I noticed something unsettling. A column of smoke rising from behind me. It appeared to be originating from a point quite near my campsite. My heart quickened, and I hurriedly adjusted my course to get a better view, straining my eye. So I could make out the ominous plume of smoke, but it was clear that whatever was burning was either at my camp or close by, concealed within the dense thicket of trees. Worried at me as I hastened back, my thoughts racing with the possibilities had I left a fire smoldering, but no, I distinctly remembered extinguishing it before my hike. The closer I got about a 4 mile from the source of the smoke, the more apparent it became that it wasn't directly from my campsite. My relief waste-tempered by the mystery. Something was burning nearby. Yet the forest surrounding my camp remained untouched upon my return. I found everything at my campsite undisturbed and no signs of fire or distress. Puzzled, I reasoned that it must have been someone else's campfire. It was an odd coincidence for someone to be in this exact location, considering there were no established trails leading here. Aiding of unease crept over me the thought of encountering strangers in the wilderness. So I decided to stay put and put the strange incident out of my mind, hoping it was just a passing occurrence. I continued with my day engaged in various camp chores and leisurely activities, trying to shake off the disquiet had settled within the time past, perhaps an hour or so, and I casually glanced around my surroundings. That's when it happened. My body stiffened and my heart leapt into my throat. There was standing amidst the trees was a man. He peered out of nowhere, his presence utterly unexpected. I couldn't fathom how long he'd been there watching me. I hesitated, then raised my arm in a nervous wave, hoping for a friendly acknowledgement, but the man didn't wave back. He was too far away from me to discern if he was watching me. But he was undoubtedly facing in the direction of my campsite. My initial fear subsided slightly, and I returned to my activities, albeit with an uneasy eye occasionally casting his direction. He remained rooted in that same spot, a solitary figure in the woods, for almost 50 minutes. The silence around us grew oppressive as I pondered his intent. Then a suddenly ashy head appeared. He vanished, its sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me with an unsettling feeling that something was terribly amiss. His inexplicable presence gnawed me thoughts. I waited for a few more, vigilant and wary, scanning the surroundings for any further signs of the stranger, but the forest remained eerily quiet, devoid of any disturbances as the sun began its descent. Beyond the horizon, I decided to retreat to the safety of my tent, hoping the night would bring clarity to the bizarre events of the day. Sitting outside my tent, I lit a fire, its warm glow providing me with a lance of comfort. A lost track of time, absorbed in my thoughts, and the fire's flickering light. An hour or so must have passed when I noticed another flickering light to my left. It wasn't the light of my campfire. It was from another source, a campfire situated deep within the forest. Oddly, it wasn't in the direction from which I'd seen the smoke earlier in the day. Instead, it was closer to where I had observed the mysterious man. My knees returned, and I peered closely at the distant campfire. Strangely, it appeared abandoned with no sign of anyone tending to it. I scanned the surrounding darkness, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw a face partially hidden behind a bush just 10 or 15 feet away. Panic surged through my heart pounding with F. Ears stared back at the figure. It was as if the figure didn't believe I could see them, but her eyes locked in a tense standoff, is wallowed hard, my body trembling, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from that face. The figure remained utterly still, crouched behind the cover of the underbrush. It took a few cautious steps back, placing the campfire between us. My eyes remained fixed on the enigmatic figure, my mind racing, trying to decipher their intentions. For an excruciatingly long half-hour, we locked eyes, neither of us moving a muscle. My heart pounded loudly in my ears. The tension in the air palpable. Then, without warning, the figure slowly began to retreat, gradually fading into the dark recesses of the forest. They remained crouched and moved silently, disappearing further and further into the trees until they were entirely concealed by the shadows. I remained rooted to the spot, my wide-open eyes darting around in all directions, my ears straining for any sound. The night dragged on the eerie silence, enveloping. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the forest, I decided that I had to leave something about the situate. Ion felt increasingly dangerous, and I had no intention of discovering the true nature of the stranger's intentions. With hasty, I packed up my belongings and headed back to my car, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrow escaped something sinister, whatever was happening out there. It was far too suspicious, and my gut told Meth that staying any longer would only invite perilous encounters. My friend Ryan and lived in a cozy small town just outside of Seattle. Over the past few years, we had both become passionate about camping and hiking, but there was something unique, captivating about setting up camp in the wilderness, immersing ourselves in the wild and living among the creatures of the forest. It was a connection with nature that resonated deeply within us. The fateful incident occurred in the fall of 2019. We had meticulously planned a typical camping trip not too far from our hometown. However, due to the erratic nature of our work schedules, it took some intricate maneuvering to find the perfect window of opportunity in the days leading up to the trip. My manager reluctantly pushed back my requested days off by one day, throwing our plans into disarray. I informed Ryan of this unfortunate twist-off, ate, but he was unfazed in his easygoing manner. He assured Meth that he would hike out to the campsite and spend the first night alone. He insisted he'd enjoy the solitude, and who was it to stand in the way of his adventure? He messaged me as soon as she reached the campsite and set everything up, reporting that tall was well. The following morning, I packed my gear and drove out to meet them. Our chosen campsite was not a popular one, mainly because there were plenty of other options nearby. Nevertheless, it had a well-maintained trail leading to a cleared out area designated for campers. It was far from a random spot in the forest as I ventured deeper into the woods. It tried texting Ryan to confirm a rendezvous, but soon lost cell service. It wasn't too alarming. At first to signal drops were common in these remote areas. However, as I continued, I realized that I hadn't received nine messages from him. I attributed it to potential service issues or a glitch with my phone, given the myriad reasons messages might gown delivered upon arriving at the campsite. I immediately sensed something was amiss. Ryan, I called out, searching the tent and its surroundings, but he was nowhere in sight. Initially, I wasn't overly concerned. There were numerous places he could have ventured off to a nearby river for fishing, or a couple of trails with stunning vistas. She could have been anywhere. Setting my backpack down, I proceeded to set up my own tent. Then I ignited a fire to warm up some canned food I had brought along. It was only noon, and if Ryan had gone hiking, he wouldn't return until later in the afternoon. As the clock approached 5, my anxiety grew. It strained my eyes, trying to discern any discernible shoe prints that would hint at this whereabouts, but the forest floor was littered with prints that led in every direction, still devoid of phone service. I was faced with limited options to locate Ryan. My only logical choice was to stay put and hope he'd return. However, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the thought of him ending back in the dark was unsettling. I added more wood to the fire and sat down, torn between hope and dread. Hours passed, and my fear escalated. Did he get Tindred Washa lost, or was she simply enjoying an extended hike? My mind raced with countless possibilities, and then just as the night was settling in, a flicker of light caught my eye. A few trees ahead, the light moved erratically as if someone were walking with it. It appeared to be near one of the trails. Relief surged through me, convinced that it was Ryan. The light drew closer, growing brighter, and I could hear faint foot steps in the distance. Ryan, I called out again, my voice trembling. The footsteps abruptly ceased, and the light extinguished. Silence enveloped the forest. I repeated his name, but there was no response, no movement, not tightened in my stomach, and dread clawed at me as stared into the darkness for what felt like an eternity. Straining my senses, an hour passed, during which I heard nothing but the ambient sounds of the forest. There was no sign of the person who had carried the light, and a creeping unease took hold of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Watching me at that point, I couldn't stay any longer. A primal instinct had met to leave and seek help. Hastily, I packed my belongings, all the while keeping a wary eye on my surroundings. I didn't believe I was being followed as I made my way back without further incident. However, it wasn't until the following day that the police were able to assist me returning to the campsite. We found everything exactly as I had left it: the tents, the fire pit, the gear all untouched. But Ryan was still missing. The authorities tracked his last known movements, showing that he had strayed off only of the trails, accompanied by another set of shoe prints. Unfortunately, Ryan's trail went cold, and the search yielded no results. The prevailing belief was that he had been taken by the same person I had encountered that eerie night in the forest. It's a haunting thought, wondering if things might have turned out differently if I had been there with him on that first day, or if it too would have vanished into the wilderness. It was early September, and I decided to take my camper out for a midweek camping trip. The woods right outside my house had plenty of dirt paths big enough to fit my truck with the camper attached, so I found myself staying there for a few nights a few times a month. My favorite spot was down a small trail that led to a secluded lake. This lake was vast, but the spot I always chose was far toorer and for most people to venture into. On that particular morning, I detached the camper from my truck and prepared my bag for a hike, although there weren't any marked trails walking along. The lake always seemed like as if better to avoid getting lost only a few minutes walk from my camper. I stumbled upon something incredibly strange. It was a trailer wedged between a couple of trees looking rugged and old, almost as if it had been sitting out here for years, but I had been down this way before, and it definitely wasn't there last time. Someone must have moved it. There recently, I hesitated keeping my distance, trying to discern if there was any sign of someone living there. Honestly, one look at it gave me feeling that it was purposefully hidden, perhaps to tee over something. Up from what I could see, it showed no signs of recent habitation, fueling my suspicions. Further, why would someone got through the effort of moving a beat-up trailer through the woods into such a secluded area? My gut told me to leave, but there was something about it that pulled me and against my better judgment. I approached the trailer and knocked on its door. Noon answered, and there was no movement from inside. I knocked once more, still met with silences. I left and walked back to my camper. The trailer haunted my thoughts for several hours as I sat outside, tending to my campfire. However, as the sun set and the stars filled the sky, I managed to enjoy my night sitting on a small chair, gazing up at the peaceful night. I was startled by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching leaves behind me in the woods. It turned and saw a light moving steadily between the trees. As whoever it was approached the lake, it was incredibly strange to see someone out there. I kept my eyes on them, but suddenly the light went out. I strained to see through the darkness, searching for any movement, but there was nothing. Then faint footsteps started again coming in my direction, and they were trying to be as quiet as possible. I stood up, my heart pounding, and called out, "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped, and it felt like they were just a few yards away from me. I waited anxiously for a response or any sign of movement, but there was nothing for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps began retreating, fading into the woods. I put two and two together and realized that the mysterious person was heading in the direction of the abandoned trailer. After the bizarre encounter and my unease about the trailer, I had no intention of staying the night. I hastily packed up, reattached my camper to the truck, and turned on my brights. As I carefully drove down the path, it took a while, but I finally made it out of the rions I reached as a distance. I decided to call the police to report the strange behavior of the mysterious man and the odd trailer. The following morning, I guided two officers to the location of the trailer, but to my shock, it was gone. What was even more bewildering was that there were clear trails on the ground showing that the trailer had been dragged all the way up to the lake, where the marks faded into the water's edge. Whatever that trailer had hidden now sat at the bottom of the lake, completely inaccessible. No evidence ever surfaced to warrant their retrieval of the trailer, leaving the mystery unsolved. It's terrifying to think about what that man could have done to me had he caught me by the trailer he was hiding. Unfortunately, I will always be haunted by the enigma of what lay behind that door. I went on a camping trip with my buddy from college, who I'll call Avento Protector Privacy. We'd been friends for a little less than a year, and both enjoyed the forest and going for hikes, but we hadn't ever stayed overnight in nature before this adventure took place during spring break at our school, and we had been planning it for a while. We carefully chose a trail we were familiar with and even had a basis idea of the area where we would set up camp on the day journey. We headed out without thinking twice. We were thrilled to see that nobody else was on the trailing. Fact, we'd chosen this specific trail because it was never a busy attraction. The trail deuced about 66 miles into the forest before we arrived at the general area where we wanted to set up camp. After pitching our tents, we prepared a small meal just before the sun was about to disappear below the horizon. Evan and I collected some larger stones and sticks to make a fire with and got it going just as it got dark. Irresponsibly, we had brought a pack of beers and started drinking while talking and just hanging out by the fire. We had some good conversations and had fun. Well, took a couple of hours and we were ready to call it a night. We put out the fire and then got into our tents to go to bed. I actually fell asleep really easily because of the calming sounds of nature, but throughout the night I kept waking up. It wasn't due to any specific noises, but I would just jerk wake for some reason. I assumed it was just me being unfamiliar with being out in the forest at night, but it still gave me an uneasy feeling. The non maybe my fourth or fifth time waking up, I heard Evan tenton zipping. I thought that was probably going out to use the bathroom or something, but he only took a few steps until I heard him open up his backpack and start searching around. Another 30 or so seconds went by with no other noises. It was like he was just standing right outside of his tent. My curiosity got the better of me, and I zipped up and eventually unzipped my tent and looked out as soon as the sound of my zipper began. I heard Evan's footsteps rush away from the front of my tent. By the time I stuck my head out, Evan was ducked down and quickly shoved something back into his backpack, then turned and looked at me with a concerned face. Is everything okay? I asked Ed, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded his head. Something about this immediately felt off. I climbed out of my tent and stood up, asking what he was doing out here. He responded by saying he was having trouble sleeping and just came out for some fresh air. But while he was talking, I looked down at this backpack. Sticking out of the top was the back end of a handgun. I felt my face turn white. I looked back at Evan and tried my best to hide my reaction, but he already knew what, as we stared at each other for a strange few seconds before he, too, Ernie Dan went back inside his tent without saying another word. I'd never seen him act like that before, and his face gave away that he was guilty of something. It was already strange that he never told me he was bringing a gun, but the way he was acting just made it even more unsettling. I stayed up for the rest of the night, sitting on the ground outside the tents and waiting for the sun to come up. When it did, I packed everything up and left. After that day, Evan never contacted me, which I guess proves that something was going on that night. I don't know for sure what would have happened in a door, why it would have happened, but I know that I was lucky to get out of the reb before finding out. The memory of that eerie night in the wilderness still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what secrets Evan was shitting in the darkness of the forest. Back in high school, my house was special not because of its size or color, but because of the vast, sprawling backyard that seemed to stretch endlessly into a thick, inviting forest. This forest was the backdrop of my childhood adventures. It was a place of mystery and excitement, a natural playground where my friends and I spent countless hours as kids. We would race through those woods, our laughter echoing among the trees. We played hide and seek, built forts, and imagined ourselves as explorers charting unknown territories. There was always this small sense of danger lurking in the shadowy corners of the woods, but it only added to the thrill. We felt like kings of our own wild domain, fearless and free. But as we grew older, the forest lost its allure. High school brought new interests and distractions. Video games, sports, and homework replaced our woodland escapades. The forest became nothing more than a scenic view. From my bedroom window, its mysteries and adventures forgotten, that changed one lazy afternoon during junior year. I was sprawled on the couch, aimlessly flipping through channels when Tyler, my best friend since kindergarten, came over. Tyler was the kind of guy who always had crazy ideas, and that day was no different. "Dude, remember how we used to play in the woods?" He asked, a nostalgic glint in his eye. "Yeah, feels like ages ago." I replied, not sure where he was going with this. "We should go back like tonight. Wouldn't it be wild to camp out there?" Tyler's suggestion caught me off guard. Camping. We had never done anything like that. The idea seemed reckless, maybe even a bit foolish. Yet, as I thought about it, excitement bubbled inside. Myth Forest had been our childhood adventure land, and the thought of revisiting it stirred something within me, a longing for the carefree days and the thrill of a little danger. Our plan evolved quickly from a simple walk in the woods to an overnight camping trip. Tyler mentioned that his parents had an old tent we could use, so with a sense of adventure rekindled, we walked down to his house to retrieve it. I should mention here that neither Tyler nor I had any real camping experience. Our preparation was laughably inadequate. We packed a bag with snacks, water bottles, and a portable phone charger. Our idea of essential camping gear, it didn't occur to us to bring things like a proper flashlight or a map. As the sun began to set, we set off into the woods. Our footsteps crunched on the dry leaves, and the familiar earthy scent of the forest filled. My lungs, for a moment, it felt like stepping back in time. The excitement was palpable between us. We were embarking on a new adventure, a throwback to our childhood, but with the independence of our teenage years, however, our nostalgia was soon challenged. By reality, the flashlight Tyler brought was pathetic, a dim, flickering light that barely cut through the darkness. It was enough to prevent us from tripping over roots, but not much else. The initial stretch of our journey was filled with banter and laughter, reminiscing about our childhood antics, but as night enveloped the woods, our conversation dwindled. The darkness seemed to swallow the sounds around us, replacing them with an eerie silence. I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the thrill of danger, the kind we used to crave as kids, but now it felt real, tangible, and slightly unnerving. After about 30 minutes of walking, the dense trees gave way to an open section of grass. It was as good a place as any to set up Camp Tyler. Ever the optimist declared it perfect. As he fumbled with the tent under the weak beam of the flashlight, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. What had started as a fun, impulsive idea was quickly turning into an uncertain, perhaps even foolish endeavor, but there was no turning back. Now we were here in the heart of the woods. We once ruled as fearless kids. Only now the darkness seemed deeper, the silence more ominous, and as we struggled with the tent, every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig felt like a warning. Little did we know our night was about to take an even more unsettling turn. The darkness of the forest was a stark contrast to the fading twilight as Tyler and I ventured deeper into the woods. Our laughs and jokes from earlier had quieted down, replaced by a tense anticipation. The weak beam of the flashlight did little to cut through the night, casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond our sight. Every sound seemed magnified, every rustle in the underbrush a cause for alarm. As we trudged along, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The forest, once a familiar playground, now felt foreign and intimidating. I remember the tales we used to tell each other as kids, stories of mysterious creatures and lost travelers back. Then they were just stories now in the heart of this dark, silent forest. They felt unnervingly real. "We should have brought a better flashlight," Tyler muttered, breaking the silence. His voice, usually so full of confidence, had a hint of unease. I nodded, gripping the strap of my backpack tighter. We were both beginning to realize that our adventure might have been a bit too impulsive. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only about 30 minutes, we found a spot that seemed suitable for camping. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees that stood like silent sentinels in the dark. The grass was soft underfoot, a small comfort in the otherwise daunting environment. Setting up the tent was another challenge. The instructions made it sound easy, but in the darkness, with only a feeble flashlight and our limited experience, it felt like a Herculean task. We fumbled with the poles and fabric our movements, clumsy and uncoordinated. Every few minutes we pause, spooked by a sudden noise or a rustling in the bushes. I swear if a bear comes out of nowhere. "I'm blaming you for this," I joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Tyler chuckled, but the laughter was short-lived. We both knew that the possibility of encountering wildlife was real, and the thought wasn't comforting. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally managed to get the tea tent standing. It was lopsided, and the fabric sagged in places, but it was shelter from the unknown, from the darkness that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Exhausted, we crawled inside, zipping the entrance shut. The tent felt like a sanctuary, albeit a flimsy one. We sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. There were moments when everything was eerily still, and then suddenly the night would come alive with the chirping of cricket or the distant hoot of an owl. It was in one of those silent moments that we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see Tyler's eyes widen in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to find my voice. We listened, holding our breaths as the footsteps seemed to circle. Our campsite, they weren't hurried or aggressive, but their steady, measured pace was somehow more frightening. Who would be walking in the forest at this hour? The footsteps faded, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was suffocating. We sat there frozen, not daring to move or speak. The reality of our situation was suddenly very clear. We were alone, unprepared, and vulnerable in the vast dark woods that night. The forest no longer felt like our old playground. It had transformed into a place of uncertainty and fear, where every shadow held a threat and every sound a warning. As we sat there in our lopsided tent, the thrill of adventure was replaced by a growing sense of dread, and I couldn't help but wonder if coming here had been a terrible mistake. The darkness outside our tent seemed to press against the fabric, a tangible reminder of our vulnerability inside Tyler. And I sat in still silence, the only sound our shallow breaths and the occasional rustle of nylon as we shifted. The flashlight now placed between us cast a weak flickering light, its beam feeble against the overwhelming blackness of the night. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the forest. The wind whispered through the trees, a sound that was once comforting but now felt like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. My imagination, fueled by the stories we used to tell each other as kids, conjured images of shadowy figures lurking just beyond our sight. The earlier encounter with the footsteps had left us on edge. They were too deliberate, too. Human to be any forest animal, I tried to convince myself that it could have been a deer or some other harmless creature, but the steady bipedal rhythm of the steps echoed in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Tyler broke the silence. You think someone's out there. His voice was a mere whisper laced with a fear I felt echoing in my own chest. I don't know, I admitted, but it's weird, right? Why would anyone be out here this late? We pondered the possibilities. Maybe another group of campers, a forest ranger, or something more sinister. The unknown was more frightening than any definitive answer. As the night wore on, the tension in the tent was palpable. We spoke in hushed tones. Our conversation revolving around what we should do leaving seemed like the obvious choice, but the thought of venturing out into the dark, unknown forest was daunting, so we stayed trapped by our own fear. The forest seemed to come alive at times and then fall eerily silent in one of those moments of quiet. The footsteps returned. They were distant at first, but gradually grew closer. My heart raced, and I could see Tyler's face pale in the dim light, his eyes wide. With fear this time, the footsteps didn't circle around us. They stopped abruptly somewhere nearby. The silence that followed was oppressive. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. It was as if whoever or whatever was out there had vanished into thin air. We sat there paralyzed, not daring to move or make a sound. Minutes ticked by each one, stretching out endlessly. The tension was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there in that suffocating silence. Eventually, Tyler reached for the flashlight. "We should check," he said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my mouth dry. The thought of unzipping the tent and looking out into the darkness was terrifying, but the not knowing was worse. With a trembling hand, Tyler unzipped the tent. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the earthy smell of the forest. We peered out, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows in the night. We zipped the tent back up, the sense of unease still clinging to us. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there listening to the sounds of the night, each one a reminder of our isolation and vulnerability that night. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. We were intruders in a world that didn't want us, surrounded by an unseen presence that watched and waited. The adventure we had sought was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a primal fear that clung to us as tangible and suffocating as the darkness itself. The night in the forest grew deeper, colder, and more unnerving with each passing hour. Tyler and I, huddled in our poorly constructed tent, were a bundle of raw nerves. The sense of being watched of an unseen presence lurking just beyond the frail shelter of our tent was overwhelming. We couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there in the darkness. After what seemed like an eternity of sitting in silence, punctuated by the occasional distant rustle or snap, Tyler whispered, "We can't just stay in here all night." I knew he was right, but the idea of stepping out into the unknown was terrifying. However, the thought of remaining in our vulnerable state, trapped inside the tent, was equally daunting. With a deep breath, we made the decision to face whatever was out there, unzipping the tent. We stepped into the chilling night, the cool air brushed against my skin. Raising goosebumps, the forest was a vast expanse of darkness. The trees, like silent sentinels watching over us, our weak flashlight seemed even more inadequate out in the open barley, piercing the dense blackness. We sat close to each other, our backs to the tent, trying to cover as much area with our limited light as possible. Our conversation was minimal, our senses heightened to every sound and movement around us. We tried to convince each other that it was probably just an animal or our imagination running wild, but the fear once rooted was hard to shake off. Then it happened. The same sound we had heard before, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, began in the distance. This time they were getting closer. Each step seemed deliberate, measured. My heart raced, and I could feel Tyler's tension mirroring my own. As the footsteps approached, the night seemed to grow even quieter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. We strained our eyes into the darkness. The flashlight's beam trembling in Tyler's hand, the silence stretched on, and then just as suddenly the footsteps resumed, but they weren't retreating. They were coming directly towards us. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what could be approaching us in the middle of the night. In the middle of the woods, Tyler shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but it was futile. The light fell short of penetrating the thick darkness. The footsteps continued slow and steady until they were alarmingly close. We could hear the faint sound of breathing just beyond the reach of our light, frozen. In fear, we sat there staring into the void, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. But nothing did. The breathing stopped. And there was a moment where the tension peaked. A moment where I felt that anything could happen. Then the footsteps began to recede. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared altogether, leaving us alone in the silence. Once again, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. The decision was unspoken, but mutual. We had to leave. We hastily dismantled the tent. Our movements, frantic and uncoordinated, adrenaline coursed through my veins, propelling me forward as we grabbed our things and fled through the woods. The journey back was a blur, a panicked, desperate escape from an unseen terror. We stumbled and tripped over roots and branches. Our only thought to put as much distance as possible between us and the forest. The forest, once a place of adventure and wonder, had turned into a nightmare as we emerged onto a neighboring street, far from where we had intended to exit the reality of our situation. Set in, we had been scared, threatened by something we couldn't even see. The night's events were a harsh lesson in recklessness and fear, one that would stay with us for a long time, exhausted, shaken, and drenched in a cold sweat. Tyler and I finally emerged from the forest. Finding ourselves on a neighboring street, the surreal feeling of being back in the familiar yet somehow alien surroundings of our neighborhood contrasted sharply with the wild, oppressive darkness. We had just fled our hearts, still pounded in our chests, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we tried to process what had just happened. We walked in silence towards my house, the street lights casting long, eerie shadows that made us flinch. Every sound, every movement around us was a potential threat. Our minds were still trapped in the forest in the terror of the unknown. Reaching my house felt like crossing into a sanctuary, the familiar walls, the soft glow of the lights. It all seemed incredibly comforting after the night we had endured. We went straight to my room, not wanting to wake my parents, and have to explain our disheveled, panicked state. Once inside, we sat on the floor, our backs against my bed. The safety of my room did little to ease the knot of fear that had settled in our stomachs. We talked in hushed tones about what had happened, each of us trying to make sense of it. "Who do you think it was?" Tyler asked, his voice still carrying a tremor of fear. "I don't know," I replied, "but it was someone right. It couldn't have been. I mean, it wasn't something else." We debated the possibilities, from a prankster to a homeless person or perhaps a hunter, but none of the theories seemed to fit the deliberate way. The footsteps had approached us, then stopped just out of sight, and the eerie way they had retreated. It was all too strange, too frightening. The night dragged on, and neither of us could sleep. Every little noise made us jump, a reminder of the unseen presence in the woods. The adventure we had sought turned out to be a nightmare, one that neither of us had been prepared for. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight filtering through my window. The events of the night began to feel like a distant bad dream, but the feeling of being watched, it lingered. "We're never doing that again." Tyler said, as we watched the sunrise, it was a statement, not a question, and I nodded in agreement. The experience changed something in both of us. The forest, once a place of wonder and adventure, was now a source of fear. We had sought a thrill, a taste of danger, but we found more than we bargained for in the days that followed. I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I avoided the backyard, the sight of the forest line, bringing back memories of that night. I wondered about the unseen stranger, about what could have happened if they had decided to step into the light. The mystery of who or what was in the woods that night remained unsolved. A haunting question that lingered. In the back of my mind, I learned a valuable lesson about recklessness and the real dangers that lurk in the shadows of adventure. As for the woods, they remained untouched, a silent, brooding presence at the edge of my backyard, a reminder of the night when our search for adventure turned into a chilling encounter with the unknown music. 4 years ago, I found myself in a peculiar living arrangement. I was staying in my friend's house while attending a nearby university. The household consisted of my friend, his sister, and their parents. Everything seemed normal at the beginning, but little did I know that this story would take a chilling turn around 2 weeks into my stay. My friend's sister invited her boyfriend to move in with us. Initially, he appeared to be a friendly and sociable guy, always sharing fascinating stories and engaging in lively conversations. We'd often gather around the dining table for drinks or unwind in the garden. While puffing on cigarettes, life seemed pleasant. However, as time passed, the cracks in his seemingly normal veneer began to show. He started ranting about government conspiracies, portraying himself as a perpetual victim. He was deeply engrossed in the bizarre concept of Sigma male and was obsessed with martial arts. But what was most alarming was his explosive temper. This guy also had a menacing dog, which he inexplicably kept locked in a cage when he wasn't around. The dog's violent tendencies became evident one day. It attacked his girlfriend, and the poor creature had to be euthanized. That's when the guilt, tripping, and incessant rants against her began. Around 2 months later, he hatched an audacious plan to live in a shipping container. This wasn't one of those chic, trendy shipping container homes. It was a rented container in a storage yard on the outskirts of town. He relentlessly intimidated and threatened the staff there, which eventually led to the police being called. Of course, he believed this was yet another conspiracy against him. His abuse towards his girlfriend escalated to horrifying levels, prompting her family to intervene and get her out of that nightmarish situation. Throughout this ordeal, I had to pretend to be on his side just to ensure her safety when they finally broke up. He blamed me, accusing me of poisoning her against him and conspiring to make her mine. She eventually found a new partner and they seemed happy together. After that ordeal, we all blocked the Psycho X on every form of communication possible. However, he continued to harass them relentlessly until Eventually, he seemed to vanish from our lives. Fast forward to last year, I began receiving messages on social media from various accounts, some friendly and some hostile. It was only after some digging that I discovered who was behind these messages. I blocked each account as I encountered them. One of these profiles, though, was pretending to be someone I knew from university. We began chatting about life, reminiscing about old times, and eventually I was invited to a house party. The invitation came with the promise of a free house and a gathering of friends. Excited, I booked time off from work and made travel plans, all while maintaining my conversations with this friend as the date of the party approached. I mentioned it to my friend's sister, who also, Thirkian, expressed interest in attending. However, when I shared the address of the supposed party location, she suddenly panicked. The address was a proper property belonging to the crazy ex-boyfriend's father, which was scheduled for sale. I decided to wait until the day of the party and called the police, claiming a suspected break-in that, as what they found, sent shivers down my spine. There were 5 people inside the house, including the sinister ex parked out front, was a butcher van equipped with food storage facilities and a collection of knives, hammers, and rope. Let's just say, I'm eternally grateful that I didn't attend that party. It was a nightmarish rendezvous I never want to experience. Nestled in the uncharted depths of Tennessee's rugged mountains, my home is a realm of secret sunk known to many vast hills, imposing cliffs and seemingly endless hollows stretch far beyond state borders, concealing a rich tapestry of history unbeknownst to most outsiders. The story I'm about to share delves into one such concealed narrative. In this remote expanse, there exists a section of forest-blanketed mountains known to the locals as Hoboken Mountain, yet to the natives entrenched in the region they refer to it as that takes this place, is shrouded in mystique, echoing a Talith that transcends mere names and taps into a hidden history veiled beneath the shadows of ancient hills and cliffs that seem to stretch into eternity long ago. Colonists ventured deeper into unexplored territories, their aspirations fixated on the coast expanse. Now, currently known as Hoboken Mountain, extensive surveys of the region unveiled a panorama of allure, wealth of animals, abundant resources, and fertile grounds promising bountiful harvests. This mountainous haven not only satisfied their immediate need, but strategically positioned became a linchpin for further settlements. The colonists, driven by dreams of prosperity, saw in Hoboken Mountain not merely a plot of land, but a key to unlocking the untold potential of their burgeoning community. During this era, the indigenous people and the newly arrived colonists existed in a state of mutual coexistence. However, as news spread of the colonists' intentions to settle in the foothills of Hoboken Mountain, a shift in the delicate cohabitation occurred. The native inhabitants, rather than adopting a hostile stance, echo sea path of caution and concern, sensing an impending disturbance, they earnestly warned the newcomers to steer clear of that particular terrain, their voices carrying wisdom rooted in fear and superstition for the darkness that lingered in Hoboken Mountain, unfazed by war warnings and superstitions. The resolute colonists, driven by prospects for jet ahead with their settlement construction, occasional skirmishes with native groups, and sabotage, motivated by fear of the ominous consequences of trespassing on the cursed ground, failed to impede it. The ire progress undeterred. The settlers successfully constructed their settlement, laying the foundation for the founding of a town. Numerous tales shroud the generations during which this settlement endured, none of them positive and all lacking any corroborating evidence. The lore weaves a dense narrative of misfortune, otherworldly affliction, and mysterious disappearances depending on the storyteller. The consensus merges that the settlement was ultimately abandoned, surrendered to the relentless embrace of the encroaching forest. Presently low, caution against venturing near those woods, while note everyone heeds the warning. Any seasoned hunter understands the unspoken wisdom, avoid those woods, and if you gotta so in a group, the unwritten rule for Hoboken Mountain is clear: never defy the rule of 2, always ensure you're in a pair, or more, never fewer in the summer of 1998. If foolishly defied the cardinal rule, while the Amazon is dubbed the Green Inferno, those acquainted with the Tennessee mountains in summer would argue it's the true Green Inferno, an expansive realm of mountains. and treasons inside the sky vanishes in orientation, fades. Raised in these woods, I'd hunted them for years, familiar with the Hoboken mountain range. However, that summer marked my first solo expedition, originally planned with 3 fellow hunters. Unforeseen circumstances left me alone, ignoring better judgment and swayed by misplaced confidence. I ventured into the woods alone, driving my truck down the road leading to the Hoboken forest entry. I left it at the road's end, commencing my trek, standing at the precipice where dirt met tree line, the forests. Emet to hold its breathing anticipation as I crossed the threshold into the woods, embarking on the track to a familiar hunting spot, a location of past success that required a 2-hour hike initially. The forest teemed with life, birds, bugs, squirrels, the vibrant sigh of nature. However, as I delved deeper, an unsettling unease settled in. Despite knowing the terrain well, I felt a natural disconnect with my surroundings. The cliché sensation of being watched manifested profoundly on this hike. With about 30 minutes remaining, I decided to pause as settling on our Ak Forest of coffee from Mythermos. I glanced down and discovered several drops of blood on ale leaf. Realization struck as I recognized the source acute on my arm. The scene took an eerie turn as a flock of butterflies gracefully descended, landing on the leaf and engaging in a bizarre struggle over probing the blood droplets with their proboscis, lost in a surreal trance. I gazed at the bizarre butterflies. A sudden snap jolted me. But as it turned, there was nothing. When I looked back, both the butterflies and the blood droplets had vanished, shrugging off the ominous fee. Ling, I pressed on with my hiker, reaching the spot where we had set up a deer stand years earlier. I found myself overlooking a picturesque clearing cut through by a stream flowing down from the mountain. The scene was enchanting, a perfect spot. I patiently await a deer. Within an hour, a massive buck merged into the clearing, slowly raising my rifle and peering through the scope. I had him in my crosshairs when he abruptly jerked his head towards the tree line. Something had spooked him, and he bolted before I could take the shot, swinging my scope towards the disturbance. I observed movement in the bushes, a pinkish blur that gradually revealed itself. What emerged was beyond horror. My heart and lungs seemed to halt in fear. In the clearing stood a naked, dirt-covered duplicate of myself, staring directly up at me with a malevolent, gaping smile of rotted, blackened teeth. Lowering my gun, I aimed to scrutinize the naked figure of myself with my own eyes without the distance of the scope potentially distorting my observation. However, in the brief span it took form, to lower the scope and my eyes to adjust, it simply vanished. Disturbed Dundee. Ice-oriented eyes that froze in the forest once filled with the lively chorus of nature now felt oppressive and eerily silent. The unsettling encounter left me grappling with my own sanity. I cautiously descended into the clearing with my rifle in hand. Where the bizarre apparition had stood, the air seemed charged with another worldly energy. Every hair on my body stood on to primal fear enveloping me. I fell thunderake into the buck. Suddenly, a human-like guttural roar echoed from beyond the tree line. Without hesitation, it turned and sprinted the dense forest once familiar. Arno felt like an ominous labyrinth closing in on me. I covered the 2-hour hike in nearly half the time. Gasping for breath, I emerged from the trees and was onto the dirt road, my hands planted on my truck's hood as if seeking refuge. In a twisted game of tag in my peripheral vision, a massive black form shifted behind a tree in the direction I'd exited the woods, glancing back. Izaw's Inglehand grotesquely human form clung to the bark before vanishing behind the tree. I hastily climbed into my truck, leaving a trail of dust in my wake, putting Hoboken Mountain in my rear view. Idudumir, the encounter was unlike anything I've ever faced before or since that day. While I struggle to fully comprehend or accept what happened, I'll share this insight: the world harbors ancient mysteries, even still in modern times, and in those aged corners, relics of a long-forgotten world may stir and come to life. Beware of old places with old tales, for those stories may linger on very much alive. I'm a mid-20s female, and tonight I found myself at the local grocery store at around 5 p.m. The winter evening was already starting to cast long shadows, and the darkness was creeping in faster than I'd anticipated. I was leisurely strolling through one of the store's narrow aisles, trying to decide between various product options. As I perused the shelves, a sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach out of the corner of my eye. I noticed a man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He had light features, glasses perched on his nose, and a scruffy beard. He had casually sidled up right next to me. At first, I dismissed it as mere coincidence. People of 10 shared the same shopping aisles, after all. However, what struck me as peculiar was the fact that he wasn't moving or reaching for any items on the shelves. He was just standing there uncomfortably close. I decided to steal a quick glance in his direction, and to my surprise, our eyes locked. It was as if he had been watching me all along, and my heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I entertained the thought that it might speak to me, but when he remained silent, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. Without wasting another second, I hastily too. Erneden walked away from the strange man. My mind raced with questions and anxiety, trying to dismiss the encounter as mere awkwardness on his part. Perhaps Shed didn't know how to initiate a conversation with a woman. That was the narrative. It told myself. However, my relief was short-lived. Barely 30 seconds later, as I had moved on to another Aisley, I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was once again approaching, his eyes fixated on me. Panic surged through my veins as I realized that this couldn't be mere coincidence. Increased my pace, feeling his wavering gaze follow me. I decided to head straight to the self-checkout area, hoping to escape his unsettling presence. As I scanned my items, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder repeatedly, fearing that he might be lurking nearby. As I finally made my way towards the store's exit, my guard was somewhat lowered. I convinced myself that I had overreacted and that the man was probably gone, but just before I reached the automatic doors, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me instinctively. It turned around one last time. There, he was right behind me, Meranch. Away, what struck me even more unsettling was that he had nothing in his hands, no groceries, nothing to suggest air or reason for being there. I came to a sudden locking eyes with him once again. I didn't break his gaze either, and my heart pounded in my chest. Then, in a bizarre twist, the lowered his head, pretending to be engrossed in his phone, and walked past me out the door. It was at this moment that I felt sheer terror. He had never intended to buy anything. His sole focus had been on me. Fear overtook me. Complete, my head spun. It thought about what could have motivated Hai. Sanctions washed just socially awkward, or did he have more sinister intentions? Maybe he saw me as an easy target for a robbery. I could see me Karna too far away, having parked near the exit. Thank goodness I immediately dialed my fiancé and without thinking sprinted towards my car. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and scanned the parking lot for any sign of the strange man. He was still there, aimlessly wandering among the parked cars with my fiancé on the phone. It started to feel a bit safer. I watched the man for a few more seconds, making sure he wasn't getting any closer. Before finally leaving the scene, I couldn't fathom his motives, and that was perhaps the most unnerving part of it all. Each time I had noticed him, he had been blatantly staring at me, far from being discreet. This lack of subtlety puzzled me. It didn't align with what I'd expected from a dangerous predator. Furthermore, the fact that he hadn't purchased anything in the store added to the confusion. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about that encounter. It was a killing and unsettling experience, and even now I find it difficult to rationalize what happened that evening. I used to work night shifts in the desolate heart of Arizona, far from civilization, at an old pueblo that had been transformed into a hotel. It was without a doubt one of the easiest jobs I'd ever had, but it came with the heavy drawback of a grueling hour-and-a-half commute each way. Initially, I loathed the drive. It sliced a significant chunk out of my precious free time, leaving Meta contemplate the idea of relocating to AO or seeking employment closer to Yuma. But the non-fateful night during what I think was mid-third or maybe fourth shift, everything changed. I spotted a random taco truck parked outside the Copper Sands RV park. It had been there before, silently beckoning to passersby, but I had always resisted the temptation to stop. After all, I had over 100 miles ahead of me. Making a pit stop seemed impractical, yet that night my stomach growled with such ferocity that I feared I might start speeding just to get home sooner. So the truck came into view on my left, swerved off the road, and pulled into the RV park's entrance. Stepping out of my car, I approached the taco truck. Its owner seemed to be either resident of the RV park or someone who diligently drove out there every night to conduct his business. The first thing that struck me was the savory aroma wafting from the truck. It was impossible to resist. I didn't just grab the tacos to go. Instead, I stayed by the truck, revving in the flavorful bites. After devouring my meal, I engaged in conversation with the truck's owner over a soda and a cigarette. He even offered those handy lemon-scented hand wipes for free, preventing me from greasing up my steering wheel on the way home over the next few months. I made this pit stop around 40 or 50 times. It became a regular part of my nightly routine. And yet it never bothered to ask the taco guy's name. It didn't seem necessary at the time, and he didn't inquire about mine. Either we were just two people sharing a fleeting interaction in the darkness of the night. However, in hindsight, I regret not asking. Yes, it would become a crucial detail in the eerie events that unfolded one evening as I rolled up to the usual spot outside Copper Sands. The taco truck was conspicuously absent. I parked my car, stepped out, and approached the truck, hoping to enjoy my usual meal. Everything appeared normal at first, not unusual for the times when the taco guy was briefly occupied elsewhere, but then the ominous silence has settled in. There was noon on the highway, and it seemed as thought the entire RV park was asleep, shrouded in an eerie calmness. While I scanned the surroundings, waiting for the taco guy to reappear, a peculiar center aged my nostrils, something burning, is stretched up on my tip too, straining to peer over the grill's counter, and there it was, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the grill's surface. I called out, my voice trembling, "Gay, I think there's something burning over here." Silence persisted, broken only by the unsettling sizzle emanating from the grill above me. With cautious steps, it made me way around the truck to its narrow entrance door. I climbed the retractable stairs and gripped the door handle. Pushing it open, my eyes were met with an empty cash register, its drawer upturned on the counter. Loose changes cattered around it. The word robbery immediately came to mind, but the lack of signs of violent struggle baffled me. Perhaps the taco guy had been forced to empty the cash drawer. Himself, my anxiety grew as I advanced toward the grill, which was still alight. I had to ascend a few more steps to reach the cooking area, and when I finally gazed upon the grill's surface, my world crumbled. There was scorched onto the grill was a perfect jet black outline of a person's hand. I recoiled, gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. I muttered aloud, "Oh my God," without looking again at that macabre imprint. I reached down and turned off the flame beneath the grill. Descending the stairs, I hastily closed the door and walked back to my cart. Trembling with fear and uncertainty, I dialed 911, trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher. A robbery had occurred and someone had been severely hurt. That much I knew, but where had they gone? Why hadn't the police arrived? With sirens blaring, despite my anxiety, I decided to wait, hoping that the taco guy might return bandaged, but alive. I waited for what felt like an eternity, 30, maybe 40 minutes, but showed up eventually. I drove home, my mind in a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. I replayed the events over and over, wondering what had transpired and why the author, Rydiash, hadn't come to our aid. And as the days passed, I couldn't shake the thought that I should have asked for the taco guy's name. It tried Googling various phrases like taco truck owner burned by robber, hoping for any lead. But the results only yielded gun-related violence incidents. I remain haunted by the night. I discovered that horrifying handprint on the grill, desperately hoping that the taco guy somehow managed to recover from the ordeal. My name's Will, and I'm from a place called Handsworth in Birmingham, UK. Yes, the same city as Spay Blinders. I'm a big of the show, and since Christmas is coming up, it reminded me of a story my dad told me a few years ago. It's a story of two parts in a way. The first part is finding out what happened in the first place, which was a big drama, but not as interesting as the event itself. So I'll dive in, and I think you'll see what I mean. Back in 1984, my mom and dad were still brand new parents, and I wasn't even out of nappies yet, so my mom mostly stayed at home to look after me. Mom couldn't work, and dad was still on crap money, so he ended up getting a part-time job as a DJ. You wouldn't think to look at him, but my dad has a sick taste. Her family has a Jamaican background, and his parents are first generation, so he loves everything from rocksteady and roots to do-band dance hall. I've got a lot of happy memories of being a kid going through his record collection and pretending it was meth. That was the selector anyway. She gets offered this gig, playing a party over in Westbrook, which is only a couple of miles down the road, so he accepts, drives over, does the gig in, then starts driving back. It's about 1 a.m, and he's just gone past the roundabout on Kenrick Way when he sees a flashing blue light behind him. He looks up in his rear view and sees a copper on a police bike behind him. White helmet, his jacket, all that stuff, so he pulls over the side of the road, turns his car off, and waits for the copper to come up to his window and tell him why he's been stopped. My dad's sitting there looking into his right-hand wing mirror, watching as the copper parks up behind him, gets off his bike, and then starts walking towards his window. But the closer the copper gets to my dad's window, the more my dad starts thinking that something isn't quite right. For starters, motorbike cops like that mostly stuck to motorways, so they could respond to big car crashes faster. Then secondly, cops are supposed to have something on the front and the back of their uniforms that make it clear that they're policemen, but instead of a little patch over his heart saying police, there was nothing there. It looked like the kind of jacket a builder might wear or something than on this guy's fee that didn't have boots on. He had all white trainers by the time. He clocked all that about the bloke. My dad's thinking, hang on, this isn't right at all. But then right as the thought pops into his head, he sees this copper who's not a cop at all reaching into his pocket and pulls out what looked an awful lot like a gun. My dad said that he did the only thing that came to mind here, ached for his keys, started his engine, and while sinking as far down into his seat as she could, he put his foot down. As she's taking off, he says the front seats just exploded in a shower of glass as his front end. Driver's side windows got taken out by the guy's bullets. She only sits up again when he's almost at the turnoff to Birmingham Road. It's only when he turns right off of Kenrick and has to turn his steering wheel all the way and back again. Had he can just feel there's something wrong with his shoulder, he makes it all the way to the Hawthorns before he has to pull over, because by that point, he's noticed how badly he's bleeding from the bullet that's gone through his shoulder. He's terrified that he's going to bleed to death or something. He ended up getting out of his car Flagey, neng down the next stone that passed him, and getting a lift to A&E at Sandwell Hospital, which is where he found out just how lucky he'd been if the bullet had hit him a few inches further down. It could have done fatal damage to his heart, or he'd probably have bled to death before he could even get out of his cart of lather one down, obviously because he needed surgery. The hospital kept him for a few nights, and the police asked him questions from his hospital bed. The first visit was all questions. The second one included telling him that his car, which he'd basically just abandoned near Hawthorne, had been found. Someone had found it and set it on fire. Because of that, the coppers who came to ask him questions started asking things like, are you involved in organized crime? And is there anyone you've angered recently enough for them to want to hurt you to each of these? Quite accusing questions. His answer was no. Every time something you've got to know about my dad for this to all make sense is that apart from his taste in music, he's basically a massive nerd. He was interested in computers growing up, got an IT job, and kept himself squee. Akai clean when he was a teenager. He was never involved in any kind of gangs or drug dealing or anything like that, which, to be fair, Hansworth's got quite a bad reputation for. The only thing he could think of which could have possibly rubbed anyone up the wrong way was having to turn down a quest at the party. He'd been playing that night. Dad said a fell had come up to him, asked for some proper agrodub track, and when my dad told him that they didn't have it, the bloke started giving him this Death Star before he finally walked off. Dad continued without any further confrontation, but this said he caught the bloke staring at him across the hall a few times, just staring and kissing his teeth, and all this other hard man stuff. Dad finishes his set, packs up his gear, and the bloke had plenty of opportunities to come up and have a go, but hadn't. Then the next thing, Dad's getting pulled over by a fake Copan, gets shot in the shoulder. My dad said that he only really put together then that was only because the police seemed very interested in the details of what Dad believed was nothing more than a minor confrontation. Dad gave the maid script, tying off the bloke. He'd been a Jamaican guy about 5'10" with a blue and white striped shirt, white jeans, and lots of gold chains. Dad also said that he was still in the dance hall when he packed up and left, and he looked legless drunk too, so there was no way that he was shopping on a motorcycle. And following him, what were the chances of him having a fake motorbike cope outfit just stashed nearby in case of an emergency? But like I said, the penny started to drop. Ash described the guy from the dance hall a few days later, one of the coppers saw, but confirmed his worst fears. Basically, the police thought that the bloke had that little confrontation within the dance hall was a yardie. Lots of people know about Yardis because of Grand Theft Auto Nicomade. Jacobus Sayardi, and he does some missions for them aside from that. Is opposed, they're famous for the same way the Yakuza and Triad are famous. They're not as famous as the Italian or Russian mafia. It's not by any stretch, but I suppose crime families get our reputation all over the world. For areas in any way, back in the early 80s, lots of Jamaicans started coming over to the UK there. Had been etrical since the 1950s, which is when my grandparents came over, but the late 70s and early 80s saw loads more unemployed Jamaicans coming over to the UK to make better lives for themselves. The trouble was not all of them were honest, hard-working people just looking to get along. The artists got their name because they tended to hang around what were basically council estates, or what they called in Jamaica government yards. If you were known criminal, you couldn't get at the job, so instead you hung around the yards with the other ardies who were always up to a good gang life in Jamaica is brutal. and there's hardly any money to go around. So when the Ardis heard that they could get over to the UK on forged documents or jump a ship on seat arrived in Bristol or London, they came over and hundreds were looking to make their fortune, and make it they did. London and Bristol got saturated fairly quickly, so the artists that arrived later ended up moving north to the likes of Nottingham and Manchester, but especially Birmingham, with it being the second biggest city in the UK, and they brought all their ER. Die Badman brutality with the mask anyone around here. And they'll tell you Badman is fairly recent slang, but ask my granddad and my dad and they'll tell you the whole Badman ting had been around forever. Jamaican culture is very macho acidus, and they artists took the whole culture and ran with it until the whole point of being a bad man yard was being the coldest. Crest, I've heard stories of Yardis shooting people dead just for giving them a funny looks. Oh, it made sense that the one my dad ran into would want to have him shot for being disrespectful and to Yardy anything tha. 'Twasn't perfectly to their liking, could be seen as disrespectful. One of the policemen my dad dealt with basically told him that they thought this shooting was connected to a handful of others that happened around Handsworth and West Brooman, and that any help my dad might be able to give him would potentially bring the mass step closer to solving quite a few other unsolved shootings. Dad told them everything he could more than once, 2 but weeks turned into months, and whenever heard from the police again. As far as my dad knows, they never caught the who shot them. And for a while, he was worried they'd come back for him. Police advised him not to go around West Brom for a while. But without his car, he wasn't going anywhere that wasn't Hana Buzz route anytime soon. Time went in, and after a while, Dad stopped looking over his shoulder, and his wound healed. He still can't lift his left arm above his head, but other than that, he's perfectly mobile. Crazily enough, this whole story came out one Christmas when my mom, who was completely smashed, let slip that my dad knew what it was like to be shot my granddad, and I had been watching some terrible old war film, offing about how awful the ACT was whenever someone got shot. Granddad says something like, they can't act because they don't know how it feels, and Nana goes, your dad is basically all hell broke loose after that, and attended with our dad telling us that story you just arted got a bit emotional toward the end because we inevitably got to the part with it. Ush, how lucky we were to even still have him around, and in my sister's case, how she wouldn't have even been born yet if the shooter's aim had a bit better. Now, I won't lie, the thought still gets me sometimes. The inking someone could be so petty as to want to end another man's life just over a freaking dub track. The single scariest thing that's ever happened to me occurred on a routine drive home from work back in 2010. I used to work in a kind of speakeasy down in Shivaport, sort of a hipster place that specialized in Prohibition-era drinks. It was a pretty cool job, but the scheduling sucked. And sometimes we didn't get out of there until 3, and occasionally as late as 3:30 in the morning. On this particular night, we finished around 3, and I found myself driving down West Shreveport with nothing but the street lights to guide my way out of nowhere. I suddenly spotted someone leaning right in the middle of the street. From what I could tell, it was a guy spread out like a starfish on the blacktop. He instinctively slowed down and swerved to avoid hitting him. As I peered out of my driver's side window to get a better look, I couldn't see any blood or obvious injuries, but the guy's eyes were wide open in a really creepy way that made me think that he was in some real trouble, or worse, maybe he was dead. Realizing it should probably do something, I reached for my door handle. Is where I was halfway out of my carb for this inexplicable feeling overcame me. I can't put it into words, but it was like I got out upon my shoulder and something in my head urged me to look behind me. When I did, my blood turned to ice. For those familiar with Shivaport, you'll know what I'm talking about. As I gazed in the direction of Joella Street near the strip mall, near the office depot, there was a row-o. Fetrice on the left-hand side where Forest Park and Wildwoods, or whatever it's called, were located. Pure instinctive mid a spot guys, their faces covered, creeping through the trees in my direction. Realization hit me like a freight train. I was about to get carjacked. Panic set in, and I jumped back into my car, slamming the door shut. But as soon as I did, the guy I had initially thought was either dead or unconscious, the same one I had contemplated offering help, to suddenly sprang up from the ground and lunged from my door handle. Before I could speed off, my heart pounded all. IKEA jackhammered the entire rest of the ride home. I was maybe a mile away before I could muster the courage to slow down. They weren't going to catch me in a tiff. I drove like I had been. If I hadn't snapped back to reality, I might have gotten a ticket. worse, been involved in a horrific car accident. May seem unrelated, but I always look back and think about how I could have escaped one dangerous situation only to meet another fate in a blind panic, thinking they might be following me in another car or something. That gut feeling I had when I stepped out of the car haunts me. I have. DB now more tire doors lower and sensing the danger, it might not be here today to recount this chilling tale. I don't think they had a gun or anything, or if they did, they didn't fire any shots. As I drove away, but a knife or event, the possibility of them running me over while trying to escape raced through my mind. I could have ended up on the street just like that guy had been when I rolled up, but with me, it might not have been so easy to get up again. In the 90s, when I was growing up, we didn't have all the distractions that kids have today. Your generation had to make up our own things to do, and more often than not meant going outside, going hunting, or inventing games. Our parents encouraged us to be outdoors, and living in a small town, there was no shortage of outdoor activities to indulge in, but one activity that almost everyone in our town partook in was riding some type of ATV or dirt bike. For me, this became one of my most cherished pastimes. I was just 7 years old when fate intervened. Man on the highway, Wasalinga YZ80, and for me, it was like discovering buried treasure. All I could think about was sitting on that dirt bike and riding it all day around my neighborhood. But my dad had reservations. She believed I was too young to handle such an incredible machine. It took weeks of relentless pestering, but my unyielding determination ultimately convinced him to buy it for him. I couldn't contain my excitement. However, the truth was I had no idea how to ride a dirt bike at the time. The first time I got on that machine, I popped the clutch, executed and unintentional. Leon flipped the bike. This incident did nothing to inspire confidence in my father, but with time, I honed my skills and became proficient at riding this machine. Thankfully, I had access to an open field where I could perfect my skills. As my friends learned about my dirt bike, they started taking me to various trails around our town, and it gradually became one of our favorite pastimes. We would do this almost every single day after school, and it's a childhood memory. Is still hold dear among the places we explored. There was one particular spot called Emmons. I never knew with the person behind the name or why it was called that, but what mattered was an old abandoned house situated deep within the woods. This mysterious house had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and it was surrounded by a network of thrilling trails featuring hill streaks and wide open stretches where you could really push your machine to its limits. Most of the time there were 2 or 3 of us riding together, but occasionally I would venture out on my own. I had embarked on solo rides several times before, but one day would etch itself indelibly into my memory. On that day, I couldn't go riding right after school. I had some homework that needed my attention, and I couldn't ride until it was done. It was already 6 in the evening when I finally set out. Thankfully, it was summer, and darkness wouldn't fall until around 8:30. My dirt bike didn't have any lights, so I knew my ride couldn't be too long. Nevertheless, Emmons was only about 5 minutes from my house. The moment I hopped onto my machine, a smile crept across my face. I adored that dirt bike. It was my pride and joy after fueling it up and giving it a once. Over, put it in neutral, kicked the bike to life, and felt the exhilaration course through me. Few days earlier, I had broken my clutch cable, so I had to give the bike a push jump on and throw it into gear. It was a maneuver I had perfected Eden. I was quite adept. My dad had ordered their replacement cable, but it hadn't arrived yet. I set off into the trails with enthusiasm, tearing through the paths for about an hour, not encountering a soul. It seemed like everyone had other plans that day. Deep within the woods, there lay an open field about 4 or 5 acres in size, enclosed your rusty, mossily intact fence. The quietness in the air struck me odd considering the noise my dirt bike generated, but I dismissed it, attributing it to my own noisy presence, feeling the call of nature. I decided to stop on the trail and relieve myself. My racing bike lacked a kickstand, so I leaned it against a fence post. As I was in the midst of my business, I noticed the eerie silence around me, in usual contrast to the revving engine moments earlier, but I brushed it off, assuming it was my imagination. Then about 50 or 60 yards away, I heard rustling eagle and seed in that direction, but saw nothing initially. So I chalked it up to a squirrel common in these woods, show ever as if finished up. An inexplicable sense of anxiety was over me, and the atmosphere grew heavy. Fun-seen eyes were fixed up on me. I scanned my surroundings, but saw nothing. My bike was just a few feet away, and I began walking towards it. With each step, I distinctly heard another step behind. The realization sent shivers down my spine. I was certain someone was following me. At this point, fear gripped me, and I was uncertain about what to do next. My only though, twas to run to me bike, jump on it, and make a quick getaway. It had to be a seamless maneuver since my bike lacked a clutch, and I had to kickstart it, push it, and throw it into gear all at once. Gathering all the courage I could muster, I sprinted towards my bike in one fluid motion. I leaped onto it, kickstarted it, and shoved it into gear. The footsteps continued behind me relentlessly, echoing my every move. I knew whatever was back there was only a few yards away. As I sped away, a sudden breeze grazed my back as if something had taken a swipe at me, narrowly missed my heart raced, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, though. I never saw anything. The sense of urgency to escape those woods was overpowering. Finally, I reached the road, stopped my bike, and tried to collect myself. It took several minutes, but as I did, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It started softly, but crescendoed into a deafening roar, reverberating through my chest without hesitation. I revved my engine and raced home as fast as I could. It was a long time before I mustered the courage to return to those woods, and when I did, it was always with friends by my side. That dreadful encounter in the woods remained etched in my memory, a haunting reminder of the unknown lurking in the depths of the forest. It was around November of last year when I had just moved to Washington State, being new to the area. I found myself drawn to the woods, so when a few friends of mine who were avid forest enthusiasts decided to take me out to a secluded spot, I thought, why not? I need some time away from work. I managed to get the weekend off, packed my bag, cleaned my riffle, and headed over to my friend's house. We ended up about 25 or 30 mile away from the Canadian border, deep within a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly. I was enthralled by the wilderness. As my home state, it didn't have anything quite like this. There were 6 of us in total, along with 2 dogs, a Labrador and a Rottweiler. Each person was armed with either a hunting rifle or a shotgun, and they all had a handgun. Except for me, we parked our cars on any dirt road, likely used by game wardens or border patrol, and hiked about 4 miles into the woods. By this time, dusk was setting in, and we decided to build a fire right away. So could set up our tents to 2 of the group, and one of the dogs went out to gather firewood, while the rest of us started setting up the tent. A massive 6 to 8 person. One November in this region could be quite chilly, but we managed to set up the tent in about 15 minutes. The trio that went to gather wood still hadn't returned, so we decided to start a fire with some branches we found around the campsite. As we were getting the fire going, we began to hear crashing noises coming from the woods, as if someone was sprinting towards us. The 2 guys who had gone to gather wood came rushing back, their eyes wide with fear. The Labrador was with them, but the Rottweiler was nowhere to be seen. They began to explain that they had seen one of Orf. Ryan's out in the woods, acting strangely. They tried to approach him, but every time they got close, he would move away. At one point, has simply vanished, and then reappeared not 10 feet behind them. They mentioned a terrible stench of rotten meat and spoiled milk that seemed to surround them during the encounter. They tried asking him what was wrong, but didn't respond. Suddenly, he bolted into the woods, and the dog chased after him, barking frantically. Soon, both the man and the dog disappeared from sight. The terrible smell persisted, accompanied by eerie giggling sounds. We were all disturbed by this bizarre story, but we initially thought it might be some elaborate prank. However, our concern grew when we realized that the missing dog hadn't returned. Either Webb began to worry about the situation, but decided to stay put. By this point, the sun was dipping below the horizons. So we built up the fire and brought out some Coleman lanterns. We huddled to getting MREs with our firearms close, and then about 15 minutes after darkness fell, the remaining dog, the Rottweiler, suddenly perked up and started growling aggressively. The stench returned, and the guys were no exaggerating about how terrible it was. The forest began to groan and creak, and we could hear branches and leaves snapping around the perimeter of our campsite. The atmosphere wastency and the sense of dread intensified. The dog's barking grew more frenzied. Soon of the guys, Sean stood up and fired 3 rounds of buckshot randomly into the woods. A horrifying otherworldly screech out from the darkness and rapidly moved away from us, taking the foul odor with it. We waited for about an hour on high alert and then decided, try and get some sleep. 2 people would keep watch at all times. I was on the first watch with another guy named Victor. The Labrador was still nearby, and we kept a close eye on the surroundings. The first 2 hours passed without incident. As we woke up, Sean and Jim for their watch, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something was very wrong. It wasn't long before I woke up to that nauseating smell on sea again, and Sean was shouting loudly. Victor and I hurried outside to see what had happened. Sean was scanning the edge of the woods with a spotlight, desperately ling out Jim's name. I asked what had occurred, and they explained that they had been sitting there when they heard one of our friends calling to them from the woods. The dog had growled and rushed toward the sound, and Jim followed after the dog, disappearing. Into the woods, C had been yelling for him when he heard Jim begin to speak, but he was abruptly cut off. Fear gripped us all, and we couldn't leave Jim out theirs. We decided to venture into the woods to find him. By this time, the foul stench had returned, making most of us feel queasy. We pushed on because we were determined to locate our missing friend. We found some of Jim's tracks, but lost the trail when they suddenly stopped, leaving another footprints leading back in the direction he had come from. The situation grew even more unsettling. Suddenly, one of the guys at the back of our group stopped and made a strange noise before yelling in anger. Wall rushed over to see Jim standing about 20 feet away. However, he was standing unnaturally, and something about him felt profoundly wrong. We approached him cautiously, asking if he was okay and if he needed help. He just stood there, with the blank expressions, lowly nodding. Yes, it was clear that something was terribly missed. Laughs and jokes circulated among the group. Except for Jim, who remained eerily silent, it was hard to believe that he had only been out in the woods for less than a day, considering his strange behavior. Back at the camp, we tried to lay him down, but adamantly refused, choosing to remain outside by the fire. A few of us went to sleep, while Sean, Victor, and I stayed up to keep an eye on Jim as we observed him. We noticed bizarre, jerky muscles, spasms, and movements that sent shivers down Erspin, as it seemed like there was something seriously wrong with him. Jim remained mostly silent and slow to respond to us, except when it came to food. We offered him an MRE, but he only ate the meat from it afterward. He got up and began to move awkwardly, suggesting that we join him in the woods to gather firewood. Despite the darkness, the ample firewood we had collected earlier, and the presence of a large campfire, his request didn't seem all that strange at the time. He gave a peculiar shrug before walking off. Strangely into the woods, we were on guard, but didn't attempt Ostopheme. A few minutes later, Sean got up and went to the tent for something, leaving me outside with Victor. That's when the dreadful smell hit me like a sledgehammer, making me gag simultaneously. I started hearing strange gibbering and giggling, a chorus of madness that sent chills down my spine. I had never felt so terrified in my life, and it was clear that Victor felt the same way. Sean came out to hearth, the disturbing sounds. Clearly her ushed back inside the tent to wake everyone up. Hef rose at the tent, flap his face draining of color ash, and muttered curses on. Dare his breath, his alarmed reaction stirred the rest of the group, and Wheel awoke in a panic. I couldn't understand why he was cursing, but it certainly had the desired effect of waking everyone up, as we counted heads to ensure everyone was present. Sean's face grew even paler. He stammered, "Where's Jimmy?" It was then that we realized something was horribly amiss. The gibbering grew louder, and a cacophony of nonsensical sounds seemed to echo through the woods. Jim's voice called out to us from the darkness, pleading for help, but his words were off-key and interspersed with unsettling giggles. We decided to stoke the fire, turning it into a blazing inferno, and turned all the lanterns to their brightest setting. We clutched our weapons, ready to defend ourselves. Westaid huddled around the fire until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. As soon as there was enough visibility, we extinguished the fire, packed our belongings, and made a hasty retreat towards our vehicles. The ominous giggling and nauseating smell returned as we hastily left the campsite. Upon reaching our cars, we were met with a horrifying sight. Chest covered the vehicles. Most of the windows were smashed and the seats were shredded beyond recognition. When needed, the cars still run, so hastily tossed the keys into the ignition. Webb breathed a collective sigh of relief as the engines roared to life. Without a second thought, we piled into the vehicles and sped away, leaving behind the nightmare in the woods for months. We avoided discussing the eerie events that had transpired, and most of us couldn't bring ourselves to admit that it had happened. One of the guys later confided in us that he had seen Jim standing at the edge of the woods, staring at us as we departed, a twisted grin on his face. I believed him, and that experience left me with an unshakable belief that I had encountered some things in Istaraskin Walker. It's a memory that will haunt me for the rest of my life, and I'll never venture into the woods so far from civilization with just a handful of friends again. In the summer of 2015, I found myself on a mission to hunt coyotes for their prized fur, armed with my basic AR-15 rifle that I had acquired inexpensively. I admired how it slung comfortably over my shoulder. I attached a sling point to the barrel, securing it messenger bag style around my neck, and hopped onto my dirt bike. The cabin on the mountain awaited our remote sanctuary where my journey would begin. As I approached the cabin and parked my dirt bike, I sensed an eerie presence lingering in the air. I had been baiting the woods with squirrel and rabbit gutsto tracked predators, but to me surprise, all the bait had vanished. An unsettling feeling gnawed at. Meth neighbor who lived just down the road had also departed in his car, leaving me alone, deciding to investigate the woods. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. Every step it took seemed to be echoed by another Ace of Fun scene. Eyes were watching my every move. I glimpsed a shadowy figure in the distance, its silhouette resembling a stick figure. I waved hesitantly, and it slipped behind a tree, dismissing it's a trick of my imagination. I retreat. Due to the safety of the cabin inside the cabin, I opted to sit down and indulge in some drinks while I contemplated my next move. The distant yell of coyotes filled the air, signaling their presence. I readied my rifle, preparing to confront a few of these cunning creatures sitting on the porch with the lights turned off. I waited patiently, but nothing crossed my path. The yelping gradually evolved into distant cries for help. My attention shifted to the neighbor's house, which stood in complete darkness. It suddenly struck Meth that he had left, but the cries for help persist. Fear gripped me as I realized that I might have encountered trouble. Perhaps El Gendry in the woods, surrounded by coyotes. Determined to help, I ventured into the woods following the dirt bike trail. The cries grew louder, leading me deeper into the forest without warning. I encountered a U-shaped dip in the trail, and instead of hitting the brakes, I coasted down, and as I descended, I heard an anguished cry for help right in front of me. Panic surged through me, and I desperately tried to steer away in the chaos. My dirt bike flipped, and my memory grew hazy as I briefly lost T-consciousness. Regaining awareness, I found myself trapped beneath the overturned dirt bike. Panic set in as I realized that my left leg was pinned beneath a heavy machine. My attempts to free myself were futile, as thought the dirt bike had suddenly gained 100 pounds. The sling around my neck reminded me of my rifle, and I dragged it within reach, though my arm was bleeding as I assessed the condition of my rifle. It noticed damage to the handguard and a cracked stock, but it still seemed functional with 30 rounds at my disposal. I had to endure the night. Ropeth that someone would find me. I sat in the eerie silence of the forest, my fear intensifying with every passing moment. Suddenly, a shuffling sound nearby shattered the silence. The atmosphere grew thick with tension as I strained to locate the sword. The cries for help resurfaced, drawing near or uncertain whether to respond or remain silent. I listened to the approaching shuffling. It was getting closer, and something loomed over the dirt bike. I averted my gaze, unable to look directly at the unknown presence, but before I could react, it grabbed my face, rendering them. A helpless my mind raced, searching for the trigger of my rifle, but it was futile. Endeavors slowly, it moved my head to face it, and what is all chilled met to the bone. The figure was grotesque, resembling a crack-addled golem with a mutilated face, his sunken cheeks, and hollowies. His breath was a noxious stench that filled my nostrils, searing into my memory. Panic surged as I felt the flash hider of my AR-15 bump against something, jolting me back to reality. It screamed with all my might, and it screamed back. I pulled the trigger repeatedly, the deafening gunshots rang. Ginger in my ears, it seized my hair and began bashing my head against the ground all while the rifle's deafening report continued. Finally, it wrested the gun from my grasp and pummeled me with it, all the while howling in torment. My vision blurred, and it felt the brink of unconsciousness approaching. Just when I thought it was over, I heard a sound louder than the creature's screams. In a moment of sheer terror, I watched as its head seemingly exploded. My gun lay a mere 10 feet away, and a brilliant light drew nearer. My world faded into darkness as I heard someone scream. A name-urging met a hold on when I regained consciousness. I found myself in a hospital bed, my head stitched up. Inquiring with my neighbor about that fateful night, I received an unexpected response. He simply claimed it was a bare common sight in those parts. Yet deep down I remained unconvinced that a bear had been responsible for the harrowing ordeal I had endured. A couple of nights ago, something chilling happened to meet Stall's Soft Park, a location frequent for some late nights. Solitude, let me provide some context. First, is situated within my city, covering approximately a square mile in total area. Mostly dominated by dense forest, there's a playground on the northern end adjacent to the street, and the park is situated on an elevated hill with the forest sloping down to a central valley. The playground is bordered by woods on two sides, and the swing set where I was perched sits about 10 feet from the fence, separating the playground from the forest. I often visit this park between 9 at night and midnight to relish the serenity of being the only person in the area. It's not that I dislike kids or crowded places, but I find solace in the quiet of the night. On the particular night in question, I estimate it was around 11 p.m. when at first there are shuffling noises coming from behind the fence. This was not unusual, and initially I paid little attention to it. Approximately 5 minutes later, the shuffling sound returned, but this time it had an eerie, almost human-like quality. My first thought was the possibility of a mountain lion event. Oh, I'd never encountered one in this park before mountain warnings were posted in the area, but they generally don't pose a threat to humans unless provoked. Still, I remained vigilant. My next thought was that it might be a creeper, and mentally prepared to jump off the swing and make a dash for my car while mulling over my options. I strained my eyes to peer at the fence that night. The moon wasn't providing much light, but its faint glow allowed me to see movements, especially of something as large as a human or animal, as I contemplated my next move. I heard a sound that can only be described as a low moaning growl, which persisted for about 5 seconds. What puzzled me was that the source of this eerie vocalization seemed to be right at the fence, just 10 feet away from where eyes at what should have been my cue toll. Ava turned into a moment of stunned paralysis, and I continued swinging for another 30 seconds or so. Then things took an even stranger turn as I swung back and forth. I caught sight of a flashlight in the distance near the point where the playground met the street, roughly 60 to 70 feet from me. Obstacles like play structures obscured my view, but I assumed it could be a police officer considering the parkway is technically closed due to the ongoing pandemic. However, I'd swung at parks after hours in the past, and the police had never bothered Methaperso. And with the flashlight gradually approached, moving at an angle toward me. Imagine the area as a clock with meets 6, and he started at 12, moving towards 7 to me, right about 10 feet from the swing set. And in the opposite direction of the fence, there was a 2020 metal overhang with a fish net and table for picnics. I hopped off the swing and crouched behind it, which in the darkness of night provided surprisingly effective concealment. I watched as the person drew closer, thought the visibility was incredibly poor. I could make out that he was dressed in a manner reminiscent of a character from the TV show Supernatural. Baggy pants, Abe stand the familiar duck bill. Hat that lids old, he seemed to have objects strapped to his arms and legs, but I couldn't discern any more details in his hand. He held a flashlight aimed at the ground hand. There was some kind of stick or baton. The whole situation was bizarre, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be in danger. It struck Meth that if this person saw me swinging alone at midnight, I might consider me an easy target. With that thought, I decided that if hecking me any closer, I would make a run for the far fence leading into the forest. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, having frequented them since I was a child, even in complete darkness. I could navigate them well enough to hide if necessary. I crouched behind the table and watched as the person briefly stopped, then continued walking towards the entrance of the forest. This marked the end of our eerie encounter. I waited in silence for a few minutes before attempting to see if I could still spot him, but it had disappeared into the depths of the forest. Reflecting on the events of that night, I couldn't be certain if the strange noise I had initially heard and the flashlight-wielding individual were connected. I knew what mountain lions sounded like, and the only other wildlife in the park were deer, squirrels, and insects. The idea of Askinwalker or something supernatural crossed my mind, but it was all speculation. There was no distinctive smell, and although the person dressed oddly, I didn't get an overwhelmingly sinister vibe from him. Furthermore, I doubted the park's size was sufficient to house a creature of such lore. As I pondered these bizarre events, I couldn't help but wonder if this mysterious figure was hunting something else entirely, and I was merely an unsuspecting observer in the shadows. The possibility lingered in my mind, leaving me with more questions than answers. Had I encountered Askinwalker or someone on a quest to confront one? I couldn't say for certain, but that night at Stallsoft Park had left me with nearly an unshakable sense of unease. I'm 22 years old, a college senior, hailing from the quiet corners of Connecticut. My semi-rural residence lies about 20 minutes away from the closest supermarket and fast food joint, a study in Washington, D.C., but note in the upscale neighborhoods you might have heard about. I'm nestled in a part of town where substance abuse issues are prevalent and the police presence is more reassuring. That troublesome, let me clarify one thing. I'm not some muscle-bound freak. I stand at 61 and weigh 240 lbs. Mostly muscle, sure, I could drop a few pounds, but who doesn't have their vices? I enjoy the occasional smoke drink and indulgent meals. It's all part of the college experience. As the diligent student I am, I've chosen aerial major accounting. I even scored an internship at a mid-sized PR firm crunching numbers and raking in a respectable $20 per hour. College isn't cheap, so I also moonlight as a pizza delivery guy after the office close to the pizza place where I work isn't exactly gourmet, and its delivery radius is absurdly large, around 20 minutes from my home and just 5 minutes from the beach, my house, north of Pizzeria, and we live even farther north, which takes an additional 50 minutes. Currently, I'm typing this to elite work stealing moments between scrutinizing the fine print on our client contracts to ensure we charge them every last penny. Believe meth will do everything to shortchange us anyway. The farther north you venture from the pizza place, the more rural and isolated the landscape becomes on this particular night. If found myself working until closing time around 9:45 p.m. I was in the back, dutifully folding pizza boxes when the counter girl approached me. With the delivery slip in hand, she mentioned that the customer who placed the order had sounded strange on the phone, as if speaking through a fan or cupping their hands around their mouth. They were also making gurgling noises. My Washington, D.C. experiences immediately conjured images of substance users given our neighborhood's reputation. However, it was more likely to be someone who had overindulged in benzo around here. I took a look at the delivery address, and I admit I was a little annoyed. It was practically in the middle of nowhere. And the last thing I wanted was a long drive. Moreover, the order was bizarre. The customer had requested a large pizza loaded with anchovies, ground beef, ham, sausage, pepperoni, and various other toppings, detailing a hopping $15 in extras. I went back to the counter girl to confirm, and she admitted that she wasn't entirely sure as she had some difficulty understanding the caller, given her age around 16. I cut her some slack, thinking she might have been daming during the call. No harm in do. Checking, so I decided to give the customer a call back. I DL'd the number, but it rang and rang, reaching 510303 times without an answer. I hung up and tried again, only to hear the number you have dialed doesn't have a voicemail box that has been set up yet. Goodbye, me manager, not wanting to waste any more time, decided to make the pizza assorted, and we would figure it out from the air. Reluctantly, it took on the delivery as I drove to the customer's location. I put on some dubstep music and revved up my turbo sub. For those unfamiliar with rural air, you should know that a winter drive through the woods can be quite eerie. It's an environment where absolute silence, broken only by the old rustle of something larger than a cat moving through the underbrush. I was speeding toward the address in this chilling silence after what felt like an eternity. I reached the location. There were a few houses on the street, each sitting on about 5 acres, so they were quite spread out. I was searching for number 1134, but I passed 1130, drove through a long stretch of empty road, and then found D1144. Frustrated and puzzled, I realized I must have missed it. I called the customer's number again, and this time I heard a straining or humming sound coming from somewhere outside my car's stereo. Grew louder and louder until I couldn't stand it any longer, fearing for my speakers at that point. My car windows were fogging up from the tension in the air. I pulled over between two of the houses and rolled down the windows, only to be hit by an overwhelming odor of decaying trash. Reminiscent of driving through Newark, New Jersey, it was so foul that I wouldn't bear it. I shifted my car into gear and started driving toward the next house, intending to knock and ask if they had made a mistake with the order over the phone. That would have been a reasonable explanation for these bizarre circumstances. As I approached the end of the driveway, in oddest to pull with a light on top of it, the plan was to pull into this house's driveway, clarify the order, and hopefully put an end to this unsettling situation. I was about 100 feet away when I spotted someone stepping out of the darkness and into the light at the bottom of the driveway. My initial reaction was thinking it must be the customer. However, the man standing under the light didn't fit the typical mold of a customer in need of a pizza delivery. He was eerily calm, wearing a massive, ill-fitting black coat that made him appear even larger than his towering stature, though he was probably 5 inches shorter than me. I couldn't see his face properly at first, but I grabbed the pizza and got out of the car, preparing some change in case he paid in cash. "Hey, sir, sorry about the wheat and all the phone calls. The delivery is pretty far," I began. But there was no response. It was then that I realized I should be watching him more closely. The red flags were stacking up, including the repulsive stench that hung in the air. It didn't make sense. It wasn't trash day. I moved the pizza to the far side of the caroof to distance myself from it and squinted at the ticket, trying to decipher the order. Still no response from them. At last, I gathered the courage to study him more closely. The guy was enormous, had no shoes on, wore ripped jeans with stains covering every inch and his face. His eyes seemed sunken in, and I couldn't even discern the pupils. They were like bottomless black craters. I started feeling increasingly uneasy between the noxious smell, his odd head movements, and those unsettling eyes. My anxiety was mounting. He was still motionless, not responding to my presences. So I stood there, frozen, my gaze locked on him. His head was bobbing from side to side, but it wasn't fluid or natural. It was more like a car door that stops halfway and requires another push to close properly. This strange head movement continued for about 10 seconds, intensifying my unease. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable in the midst of this bizarre encounter. I noticed that the man was smiling. It was a chilling, unnatural smile that sent shivers down my spine. I hadn't paid much attention to his mouth before, but now I couldn't look away. He continued to smile with that eerie grin, and as a start, I heard him speak. Can you please come get this also? I think you might have dropped your phone or something when you were hiding a body or whatever in the woods." I stammered nervously. I was still clinging to the hope that this man had taken too many pills and was MPLI having a strange interaction to my astonishment. His mouth opened and his head stopped its erratic movements. She uttered a word that sent a chill down my spine. What his voice was strained, fragmented, and disjointed, almost as though he was trying to say something else, but couldn't. I was stunned and baffled by his response. "What?" I repeated. My voice is shaky. It was shish, he replied, and the words sounded and unnatural, as though he were struggling to communicate. My heart raced as my mind went into overdrive, trying to make sense of the situation. His "what I'm a ne jed," touted my anxiety mounting. The man still not moving from his spot. Repeated the phone, wash his phone's not this anymore. I was trembling now, feeling a sense of impending danger. The words she spoke made no sense, and his demeanor was increasingly unsettling. In one jerky motion, he propelled himself closer to my car, and I could hear his voice change, as if it was coming from a different source entirely. "Go away, stop following me. I will call the police," he said, still not moving his mouth, and his voice took on a completely different one I had never heard before. "Fear Gry, Pede Melikovis," and I finally found my voice. "I'm going to call the cops, man, if I don't just get out of here." I shouted, panic overtaking me. That creepy smile widened on his face, but he didn't move his mouth. Instead, I heard him speak again, this time in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "Away, stop, police." I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape this bizarre and terrifying encounter without further hesitation. I shoved the pizza toward him and made a hasty retreat to my car. I didn't even bother closing the door properly. I just needed to get away from this stranger. My heart was pounding and it sped down the road, leaving everything behind. The pizza, the car door slightly jarring my fear-stricken thoughts. I drove about 80 miles per hour for a quarter of a mile, then abruptly executed a U-turn. I didn't want to get any more lost in this unfamiliar area with that eerie man still lurking around. I quickly returned to the spot where I had left him, only to find that he had vanished into thin air. As I finally reached the end of the road, preparing to merge onto the main road, I instinctively glanced right to check for oncoming traffic. What as I froze my bull. Uddemon's face was just inches away from mine, mere inches from my car window, his eyes boring into mine. I turned left as fast as I could, my heart racing, leaving him behind back at the pizza place. I was shaking uncontrollably. I did something I ever did while working. I lit a past cigarette desperately, trying to calm my nerves. When I walked through the front door, the counter girl informed me that the man from the open space house had called back. She said he claimed I had forgotten some food, but I had only ordered a pizza. Hadn't. I was on the verge of tears as I glanced at my phone, which had been thrown around the car during my frantic escape. There were 14 missed calls from the same number. I listened to the voicemails, but all of them were empty except for the last tone in that final voicemail. All I could hear was ragged breathing and those same low grunting sounds that the man had made earlier. I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. I sat there for 10 minutes attempting to regain my composure. Then I remembered the change the man had left on the roof of my car. I mustered up the courage to step outside and shine a flashlight on my car's roof. It was covered in a thick viscous, foul-smelling substance that resembled copper. It gagged and heaved, and as I inspected further, it found the quarters she had left surrounded by the same repulsive goop they were stuck to, it along with what appeared to be a small chunk of soft tissue. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Panic surged through me, and I rushed back into the pizza place. My nerves were shattered as I asked the counter girl to call the man's number. Again, she made several attempts, but the phone consistently went straight to voicemail the next mo. I handed the mysterious number over to me uncle police captain in a nearby town. He informed Meth that it was a burner phone paid for in cash, making it nearly impossible to trace. The phone was now turned off. Ever since that night, I've been sleeping with the lights on, haunted by the eerie encounter in the woods and the unsettling stranger who seemed to defy explanation. My name's Ellie. Last year, my friends, James, Peter, and I decided to go camping in the woods near my house. We live in a small town called Supply, North Carolina. The first day went by like any other camping trip, where-rived at the pond, packed our gear, set up our camo, and lit a fire to kick things off. The second day is when things started to take a strange turn. After waking up and enjoying it, we decided to go fishing by heading about half a mile through the woods to reach the nearby river. As we walked there, James pointed out some peculiar footprints on the trail. Now, I consider myself a hunter, and the deer around these parts aren't much larger than a Great Dane, but these tracks were different. They were bipedal, which was downright curiosity got the best of us, so I knelt down to examine those tracks more closely. They were almost as big as my hand, and I had never seen deer tracks that massive. We continued down the trail, discussing the unusual tracks as we made our way to the river. Once we reached our usual fishing spot and cast our lines, everything seemed normal. For about an hour, we managed to catch 5 decent-sized red drum. And with excitement, we packed up to head back to camp. However, our excitement quickly turned to dread when we heard a blood-curdling scream that seemed to goon for an agonizing 15 seconds. It was distant, so I brushed it off, suggesting it was probably just a panther or something, since there had been mountain lion sightings in the area. Our turning to our campsite, we noticed that the same peculiar tracks we had seen earlier now surrounded our tents. 3 enormous claw marks adorned the outside of one of our tents. I began to suspect that someone might be Ainga Prankonis, as some of our friends knew we were camping here. We decided to stoke the fire and make break fast, trying not to let Eunice creep in the rest of the day. Passed relatively peacefully. We took leisurely walks, went swimming, smoked a few more joints, engaged in conversations, all while savoring the final days of summer. When night fell, we retreated to our tents. I woke up to the sound of that same horrific scream from before, but this time it was much closer. Fear gripped me. I grabbed my Mossberg 500 shotgun and cautiously emerged from Mum. Yaitent, James, and Peter were already outside their tents, wide-eyed and terrified. I asked if they heard it, and James affirmed that they did, explaining that it had been too unsettling to ignore. It threw some logs onto the fire, and we huddled together, straining our ears to pick up any unusual sounds. The Nassif, the forest itself, had fallen silent. The sounds of birds, bugs, and rustling leaves, seized heavy footsteps started to encircle our camp, and we exchanged nervous glances, but couldn't spot anything in the darkness. Moments later, a massive figure stepped into the league. HT cast by our campfire. It was so enormous that it defied any logical explanation. Even is standing at 63 felt dwarfed by it. Initially, we thought it might be Beeperson, but it was simply too big and appeared almost solid white. Its body resembled that of a man, but instead of a human head, it wore a grotesque deer skull. As this enigmatic creature drew near, I could no longer contain my fear and fired 3 slug rounds into its chest. The creature halted, seemingly unfazed, and locked its hollowy sockets onto me. In a moment of desperation, I urged James to retrieve the car keys from Myth Creatures, shifted its attention to Peter, and it fired a 4th round into its stomach. He responded by fixing its eerie gaze upon me, and bizarrely seemed to smile. Panicked, we sprinted for the car, keeping our eyes on the creature as I aimed my gun once we had all clambered into the vehicle. James revved the engine and sped down the narrow, winding dirt trail. We must have been going at least 60 miles per hour when Peter suddenly screamed. In the same instant, the SUV was jolted to the side. I peered out the rear window and saw that the creature was still in pursuit. Effortlessly keeping pace with us. James did something almost superhuman to coax even more speed out of the car. When we finally reached the main road, we knew we were safe. We kept driving, not stopping, until we were far away from that horrifying campsite. Since that night, we have not ventured out camping again. And I'm not sure if we ever will until we hadn't shared or encounter with anyone, but I've been listening to your channel for the past 3 years. I thought maybe someone else had experienced something similar in this area. My father told me story once, and I'll never forget it for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But once that isn't the reason you hear stories on TV or sometimes overhear something in a public place, people talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, that isn't real. They're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, something like that. You just can't believe it until something happens, something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way that you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you, or maybe you heart the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a bit bigger than you thought, as I said. This is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down that it was true. It wasn't until it started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his lie. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it when he chose to call it something other than it. The called it Haskin after an old Navajo tale his grandfather told him, but I'll tell you the story the way he told it to him. We were out hunting one night, killing coyotes for $50. Haskin lived on a dairy farm in Ohio, and sometimes we'd kill a calf. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes while we were out, we'd come up on a deer and kill it. Her landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home walking because we didn't have a Cara four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods, and that's when we came upon it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first, we figured it was a pack of coyotes we'd seen. Sometimes they scavenge and then start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this wasn't like that. When a pack of dogs, wolves, or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off one that's weak, sick, old, or just small. You'll hunt it, draw it into a corner someplace it can't get out of, and then they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha, and that deer will never see that alpha. They might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its throat is gone, and then it will drop dead. It's quick, it's clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run upon a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, and wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were three bodies just torn apart. You'd see a head here, a leg, the raiders over their predators. Don't do that. They do. Leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It hadn't it for fun. But we didn't know that we saw a bunch of carcasses, and we thought it's something that we've got to take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack off for all dogs, but I wasn't leaving him. And I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. I was only 13 at the time, so .22 rifle was about the only gun I could reliably use. Ad had the shotgun, and he wasn't going in there without it. It took me why. Leto convinced him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard. Either we just followed the blood, either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for I don't know. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. Wes started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been a lover of the world, and I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming: deer, foxes, rabbits, raccoons, and birds, just scared. Now, keep in mind, this is maybe 12, or except for the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to be awake, but they weren't just awake. They were moving. I saw flocks of birds that fly straight into trees, just trying to get out of the re. We came upon a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple, thinking that it was what we were looking for, but then we saw that they were running towards us. They ran right past us, didn't even notice. And then some deer did the same. And then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of. We should have put it to Jeh. That maybe whatever we were tracking, it wasn't something we were supposed to see, and it wasn't something we could kill. I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature to go toward trouble, to fight, and knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land, but where the deer blood was zen. A thing had taken a single step like they were leaving. It for us to fin the tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pound, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing around 40 pound nearly to Remy dam throat out hunts, and all that means is that it's quick and it's hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take long for us to find where it is. There's this old school house that sits on the top of the hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, and nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in the reso. Matimes or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was just some sick kid riding a high, but we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards and we heard this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds, one a high-pitched screech and another a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards and we heard the sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Now, Dad looks at me, kneels down and whispers, I've got to stay behind him because we're about to corner Tenier. An animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator, but we can't tell by the tracks that it's just when he tells me. It's probably a single feral dog, probably rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting until it doesn't move anymore. And then slit its throat if it gets to Daddy. It's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off of him. So he walks up and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his sides. I can see what it is I wish to this day that I ha. It was leaning over a car, steering off its flesh and throwing what it doesn't nibble at its side. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white human looking, but not quite humaneth, had arms and legs like a human, but it's like a monkey hunched over. Its hands weren't normal, a thad long fingers with claws at the ends. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try to get it, to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that, and not af. Tear it, but for 2 seconds, nothing made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, made this shrill cry, and jumped on. He got a shot off. I think he missed it. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him, tearing parts of him off. As started shooting it with a 22-point blank, but it barely bled the thing. I got off 5 rounds, and then it started hitting it with the gun, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin, and then it moved up to tore off his throat, his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripping off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones in that tube in your neck, and then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ends up in the thing's shoulder and my dad ends upon my back. I'm running, and by God, I'm running faster than I'd ever run before or after. And I know it's following me. I end up back in the woods opposite the ones we'd been in. I'm heading towards my landlord's house because it's half a mile away. I can hear his thing screeching. Then moaning, I heard the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone taking an axe to every single tree. I pass its cracking so loud and off 10, but I'm not looking back. Finally, a trip into gravel, I look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire, scream and cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me. And I'll never forget what he said. What's that on your back? He's mean, just as she had said. If I saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere it was, what was Lee? Tee off my dad most of his head hister, so but nothing after the waist. Suddenly we hear its screeching and he grabs. Memmy dad gets thrown in the ground and I'm fighting him crying because I think we can still save him somehow, but my dad had been gone before I even picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside, and they're locking doors and getting guns ready. The landlord looks at me asking what happened, but I just don't know what to tell him. Had pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something, Jerus out there, all the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there in 15 minutes. We'll look outside, and we see it walk in front of the fire. I don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like a napeen. Suddenly something goes through the window. We shoot at it. But it tain't the thing, it's my landlord's dog, just the body, though. Now this head or legs West start pushing things in front of the door and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open and we hear metal and glass just getting ripped. Paid apart, we put a kuchanda TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more. But the knit got quiet, not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some. and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me pistol, and no sooner did I pull the hammer back, did we hear something shatter upstairs, then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder and it didn't echo and fade out because it was inside with us. Well, rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did a toe pinned it just a bit in 4 or 5. Men just slammed into it. It got a chance through someone with a shotgun, took care of that, put the barrel right up to its wrist, and pulled the trigger, cutting its hand clean off. That only made it angry, though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other doing the same. That wood just wasn't going to hold. So someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing, and there are splinters everywhere, 2 or 3 of them, just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't know where it went after that. The police showed up. I was still glued to that door, what was left of it. And the sun was up before they got me off it. They put me in a hospital for a while. And a lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long, long time. When we got back home, I got a job from the landlord working on the farm. We didn't talk much note about that thing. But I signed up for the Army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north, or so they claimed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't help but ask my father how they could conclude that so confidently, especially when they had these veered hand evidence. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief, as if reliving the horrors of that day. He stammered as she spoke, his voice barely a whisper that had never made it back to the station. He confessed his words, hanging heavily in the night air. My heart raced as I leaned in, eager for more of the chilling tale. The cop who had in his car, he continued. You wrecked and drove into a tree head on an impact, and the hand was never found. The gravity of his words sank in, and I couldn't help but wonder about the sinister forces at play. A sense of unease crept to Vermees. I probed further, seeking answers to the unexplainable. I asked him how the authorities could disregard such a bizarre occurrence, but his responses sent shivers down my spine. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand even exist at all, he whispered, said that its imply was the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I gulped, my mind racing to comprehend the unsettling details of this unsettling mystery, and ever ended up talking to that landlord again. My father's grim words, leaving an indelible mark on my remorse of his disappearance while I was away at basic training, swirled with the police, chalking it up to him owing money to dangerous people and simply running away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't that simple. As I there, listening to my father's harrowing account, and made silent vow to myself, I would never venture back into those woods, see even if I had the whole goddamn USA Army at my back. The story Each shared about the creature, whether it was the rake or Askinwalker, still left me unsure of what to believe. Years passed, and when my mother passed away, my father seemed to lose all sense of purpose. It was as if he felt he had nothing left to lose. He disappeared into those dreaded woods, and he never returned. The FBI was called in, and they put on a show for everyone involved. But I knew deep down that they weren't truly looking for him, and they never did find him to this day. The mystery of those woods and the unexplained horrors that lurked in them continued to haunt. Methought my father's unsettling tale still echoes in my mind, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a lingering fear of what may be lurking in the darkness of those unforgiving woods. He was 22 years old, deep in the heart of the Ozarks in Arkansas, equipped with some new gear that I had been saving up for months, from my sturdy boots to a tactical vest and Devon Ale military spec gas mask. It felt like Christmas morning to be out there, eager to field test my personal prototypes, my trusty nugget, then gunwash holstered at my side, a weapon that wouldn't do much against big bears, but would certainly ruin the day of any snake, stray dog, or cougar that crossed my path. I had a couple of loaded clip-hanes ready to go, along with some rolled-up targets stashed in my pouches. Additionally, I was well prepared for anything the wilderness might throw at me, with a compass, topographical map, thermal blanket, extra underwear, MREs, a canteen, and a Camelback hydration system. I was basically armed and ready for the inevitable invasion of any kind. I was having a blast navigating the dense woods, testing the limits of my gas masks, field of view, and evaluating the reliability of the clip-hanes. I wandered alongside a peaceful creek bed, deciding it was the perfect time to practice some guerrilla tactics, the late summer, early fall season. Ensured that there was no risk of getting my gear wet in the non-existent stream. although I was starting to feel the moisture build up inside my gas mask due to my own sweat after a quick safety check. I began a series of screen slide uphill hustles and full-on survivalist maneuver. However, I quickly realized that the combination of my heavy gear and the sweltering weather made me winded, panting, and switty. I found myself standing in that dry creek bed, contemplating my position on the topographical map to set a course for home amidst my efforts to orient myself. I caught an unusual smell at first. I attributed it to my own perspiration, but the odor soon transformed into something far more sinister. It was a putrid, whelming scent, a complex blend of rotanimal, musk, garbage, garlic, and something like skunk and onion sludge. It was so noxious that it nearly made Megage. Instinctively, I reached into my pouch and took an Adderall for extra focus, then drew my nugget, ensuring it was in working order. I was determined to be prepared, but I prayed I wouldn't have to use it. The smell persisted, growing stronger, and I knew whatever was amiss. Injit was getting closer. With a deep breath, I decided to pull my gas mask from around my neck and over my face. It provided some relief, but the mask wasn't entirely airtight around the joint, so allowing traces of the stench to seep in. I proceeded cautiously and silently along the creek bed, heading towards the area where the slope was shallowest. As I crept forward, I strained my ears, listening for any snapping twigs or animal sounds from above. There was definitely something shuffling around, and it sounded larger than anything my nugget could handle. It emitted a tant snuffling grunt accompanied by sloppy and coordinated movements through the underbrush. My mind immediately jumped to my father's stories about big bears. My dad, an Ozarks resident for 50 years, had shared tales of these bears, claiming they weren't just black bears, but also brown bears, the result of a mysterious hybridization. The offspring were larger and meaner thanks to something called hybrid vigor. He had even shown me photographs to prove his point, revealing a massive black and brown creature rumaging through a cloth line, emphasizing this easy and height difference from the clothes line in the background. Back to my story. I was contemplating hiding when I finally caught sight of the source of the stench. It was not a bear, though it had bear-like features. It resembled a bizarre fusion of a grizzly bear, a sloth, and something entirely otherworldly. Its elongated snout resembled a stubby trunk, and its body was bulky, covered in dirty matted fur. I was mesmerized by the sight, studying the creature for what felt like an eternity. Astonishingly, it hadn't noticed me, yet my overactive imagination tried to label it as some sort of creature from science fiction like a Zolidor. But it was far from any classification I could muster. My fascination was broken by a sudden interruption, a farty as a simple bodily noise in the midst of this bizarre encounter. The creature halted its movements my breath caught in my throat, and my heart raced. The only sounds in the woods were the echoing fart and the sound of my heart pounding against my chest. As the creature shifted its attention towards me, the creature sniffed the air, emitting a loud growl that had my entire digestive system. Am preparing for a siege. I fired my nugget, not the creature, but into the ground. Beside it, there was a puff of dirt and hair, but no blood. It seemed that the creature's unkempt fur served as natural body armor. Undeterred, the creature reared up on its hind legs and growled menacingly. I knew I had to act fast, so I worked the bolt and fired again, this time aiming at its bizarre face. The shot hit home with a sickening sound, but to my surprise, the creature seemed unfazed, save for a trickle of blood. It roared and lurched towards me in sheer panic. I yelled and fired a third hot shot in a random direction, desperate to scare it off. Amazingly, it worked. The creature dropped to all fours, its strange noises still echoing in my ears, and I managed to shuffle away from it. I stood there trembling as the sky transitioned from blue to orange, realizing that my father's stories about big bears had been partially correct. When I eventually made it home and recounted the encounter to my dad, he refused to believe me entirely. He locked the doors and retreated upstairs for the rest of my visit, only communicating through a few cold drinks. Oddly enough, I wasn't frightened during the encounter. My curiosity had outweighed my fear, and the Adderall probably played a role in keeping my panic at bay. It was the day I met a creature unlike anything I'd ever imagined and lived to tell the tale.